Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 16 of Masechta Ksubis. Friends, there's some interesting stuff over here. So, we're starting the second parak of Masechta Ksubis. So, interestingly or not, we're gonna continue kind of on the discussion between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua about if we can rely upon the testimony of the bride or do we not. And we get to this cool concept that maybe you've heard of before of Apesha, also Apesha Hitir, which is pretty interesting stuff. That the fellow who says that something is Asur can be the same fellow to say that something is Mutter. We're going to get into that pretty soon. It's an interesting sugya, I think, and that's going to kind of continue for sort of a little while. So, friends, let's start the second parak of Masechta Ksubis, Daf Tesva of Amud Beis. At the beginning of the parak, Ha'isha shenis armila, o shenis garsha. So if you have a woman who becomes a widow or a divorcee, and now, of course, wants to collect her ksuba, right? We've been talking about this marriage document, and that in the event that the marriage dissolves, so then the wife would be able to collect the money described, determined, delineated in the ksuba, in this marriage document. So Isha shenis armila, so if she becomes a widow, or shenis garsha, she gets divorced. He omeres, so now here comes the negotiation. She says, Besula nisasoni. She says, look, I was a Besula at the time that we got married, and for whatever reason they can't find the document right now, and now they're just arguing it out. She says, I was a Besula, and therefore the contract was for 200 zuz. And he, assuming that they're getting divorced rather than he's dead, because if he's dead, he can't argue with her. So, if he's dead, then this argument would be with the estate. So, okay, so in the case of divorce, so she says, she was a basula, and therefore the ksuba is 200 zuz. He says, no, I married you, you're an almana, and therefore the ksuba is only 100 zuz. So if there are witnesses who can attest to the fact that she went to the chuppah behinuma, and Gemara is going to explain on tomorrow's daf what exactly a hinuma is, but some kind of indication that they only, something that they would only do for basulas. When a basula gets married, Rosha Parua, and her hair was sort of let out, Ksubasum Asayim. So these are sign, right? These are things that they would only do by the chasana of a basula. So if there are witnesses who can attest that at her chasana they did these things, so then Mele she was a basula at the time of the chasana, and her ksuba is 200 zuz. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer Afchilu Kloyus Raya. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says another sort of indication that when she got married she was a basula is that if they gave out some kind of roasted grains or something, it was some kind of, I guess, pitzuchim, some kind of, a thing, the food, snack, candy or something that they would give out to the, that they would dispense at the wedding of basula. Friends, what's your opinion on sunflower seeds? Shver, right? Alright. Sunflower seeds are not ideal, in my view. Umode Rabbi Yehoshua, b'am lechaveru, sode zo shel avicha osir lekachti imenu, shu neman she'apesha osir hu apesha hitir. Friends, do you hear that? So Rabbi Yehoshua admits. Now the Gemara is going to kind of try to understand what's he admitting, who's he admitting to. But anyways, basically let's say this. Rabbi Yehoshua says, so Ruvain says to Shimon, he says, Shimon, this field, it was your father's, by the way. But before you get your hopes up, he sold it to me. Shehu Ne'aman. Reuven is believed, right? Meaning, he says to Shimon, Shimon, this field that we're looking at was your father's. And Shimon gets his hopes up and he says, what? It was my father's? Does that mean it's mine? And Shimon says, no. And Reuven says, no. Your father sold it to me. So we believe Reuven, because a pesha also a pesha hitir. Reuven didn't have to say anything to Shimon. Shimon had no clue that this field ever belonged to his father. Reuven didn't have to ever mention it and plant any seed in Shimon's head that maybe it's his. And therefore, from the fact that Reuven didn't have to say anything, and he went out of his way and he told Shimon, by the way, this field at one point belonged to your father. So he's then also said, believed when he says, but he sold it to me. Right? Meaning, Reuven could have just said nothing to Shimon and then just kept the field and everything would have been easier. So therefore, since he could have just kept quiet and instead he mentioned that it belonged to Shimon's father, but that Shimon's father sold it to him, Reuven, so he's believed about the whole thing since there was nothing sort of requiring him to ever have to mention to Shimon that it belonged to his father. Right? That Reuven, who made it potentially usher upon him by saying that it belonged to Shimon's father, he's also the one who's saying that, but Shimon's father sold it to him, and now once again making it mutter to him. So he was sort of in control of the whole situation. He's the one who made it usher to himself, right? Reuven's the one who made it usher to himself, but he's also then the one who makes it mutter to himself. But if the situation was different, that there were witnesses that came and said that, wait, what's the deal with this field? Doesn't this field belong to Shimon's father? And then Reuven says, oh yeah, but Shimon's father sold it to me. Well, that's a different story. Because now he's not the one who was making it usher upon himself. Other people are coming and contesting his ownership and saying, wait, does this field really belong to you, Reuven? We have witnesses to say it belongs to Shimon's father. So then Reuven is not simply believed to say, oh yeah, but Shimon's father sold it to me. At that point, he would have to prove it. Right, so again, if there are witnesses who testify that the field belonged to Shimon's father, well then, and he says, oh yeah, but no problem, I bought it from Shimon's father, he's not believed, because in that case, he's actually going to have to prove that he purchased the field from Shimon's father. Now, says the Gemara, sort of trying to apply this case or filter this case or view this case, to look at the Mishnah and try to see how it fits into the machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua from the previous parak, right, where Rabbi Gamliel seemed to be saying that we rely upon the testimony of the bride, whereas Rabbi Yoshua seems to be saying that we cannot simply rely upon the testimony of the bride. So now, time the ika edim, holeka edim, bal meheimin. So if we look at our Mishnah that we just read, so we had said, look, if there are witnesses who could say that she went out with this hinuma or with her hair let out, right? So if there are witnesses who could essentially testify that she was a besula at a chasana, so then her ksuba is 200 zuz. But absent of witnesses, if there are no witnesses, well then we do not trust her, and we would go based on his argument. So again, so time of the ika edim. So the reason why we can trust her that the ksuba is 200 zuz is only if there were witnesses who testified that she was beinuma, virosha porua, or maybe that they gave out certain candies. But haleka edim, if there aren't such witnesses, bal meheimin, well then we'd believe the husband that the ksuba is 100 zuz. Leimetanan stamid lo Rabbi Gamliel. So then let's say our Mishnah is unlike Rabbi Gamliel. Is not like Rabbi Gamliel. The Rabbi Gamliel ha'amar ihi meheimna, because after all, wasn't Rabbi Gamliel's opinion that we believe her rather than him? So afilu teim Rabbi Gamliel. So Gemara says, no, you can even say that our Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Gamliel. And then Rabbi Gamliel would say in our Mishnah that we would only believe her if she can produce witnesses that she was a besula. Because ad kan lo ka'am Rabbi Gamliel ha'asam ela bebari v'shema aval hacha bebari uvari lo amar. Friends, do you hear that? The Gemara points out a distinction, which is that in the previous parak, it was a situation of bari v'shema. right? She is making, right? He says, look, I thought I was marrying a Besula. It turns out she's a Be'ula. She says, when we got engaged, I was a Besula. Misheir Astani ne'enasti. But after Erisin, I was raped. And nistachva sadeu. And, sorry, dude, tough luck. And therefore, she's saying for sure, right? She's saying unequivocally, Misheir Astani ne'enasti, that she was raped after Erisin. And therefore her, and therefore her Ksuba is 200. She's saying that Bari, 100%. What's he saying? He's saying, I don't know, but maybe, right, maybe already this happened from before we got engaged, in which case, already at the time of Kiddushin, you were not a Besula. He says, I don't know. How do I know that? How do I know Misheir Stanin and Nasti? Maybe it was from before. So she's saying 100% that Misheir Stanin and Nasti. He's saying, how do I know? Maybe already from the time of Kiddushin, maybe already you were not a Besula. But he's not saying that for sure. He's saying it's a possibility. So therefore, in that case, Rabbi Gamliel would say, look, her argument is 100%. His argument is maybe. So therefore, we're going to trust her because Bari V'Shema Bari Adif, that if you have a certain argument against a possible argument, so we prefer the certain argument. However, in this case, it's double certain arguments, right? She's saying that when she got married, she was a Besula. He's saying, not true. When we got married, you were an Almana. So in that case, Rabbi Gamliel would say, look, she's making 100% argument. He is making 100% argument. In that case, we cannot rely upon her. So therefore, let's read that again. So if you take Rabbi Gamliel, you can even say that this Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Gamliel, because Ad Kan Lo Ka'amar Rabbi Gamliel Hosam, because the only reason why Rabbi Gamliel says in the first parak that we rely upon her view, or her version of events, is Ela B'Bari V'Shema, is because her argument is certain and his argument is maybe. Aval Hacha, but over here in our Mishnah, where she's saying that she was a Besula and he's saying not true, you were Be'ula. So B'Bari Uvari, where both arguments are 100%, Lo Amar, Rabbi Gamliel would not say that we rely upon her version of events. Udukarila, my Karila. Now, what was the Hava Mina to say that Rabbi Gamliel would say that in our Mishnah also we would go based on her testimony, right? The Hava Mina was to say that, well, if in the previous parak Rabbi Gamliel says that we go based on her testimony, based on her version of events, so Memela then we would assume that the same would apply to our Mishnah. What was the Hava Mina? Habari Uvari, right? Habari Uvariu. In our Mishnah, after all, it's two conflicting 100% arguments. Why would we even have the Havamina to say that Rabbi Gamliel would definitely go with her version of events? Well, because the answer is Kevin the Rav Noshim Besulis Nisos. Well, since most women when they get married are Besulas, Kibari Vishema Dami, then I may have thought that it was like a Bari Vishema, right? That, meaning even though, yes, in our Mishnah, she's saying she was a Besula, he's saying that she was a Be'ula, right? So therefore it's Bari Uvari. But nonetheless, here's the thing, what's sort of working in her favor is that most women, when they get married, the assumption is that they are Besulas, in which case, it's sort of, that can sort of bolster her argument to say that she was a Besula based on the fact that most women who get married are Besulas, and therefore maybe we can consider it like she's Bari and he's Shema, and therefore maybe we should in this case as well. Right, Rabbi Gamliel would say that we go based on her argument. So nonetheless we're saying no, we view them as Bari and Bari, that it's two conflicting 100% arguments, and therefore even Rabbi Gamliel would say that we cannot necessarily rely upon her version of events. Ve'achinami mistaver, and this taka makes sense to say that Rabbi Gamliel admits that in this case we do not necessarily go based on her testimony. Where am I? So this talk also makes sense to sort of view the Mishnah in this way, that even though in the first parak Rabbi Gamliel said that we go based on the bride's position, because that was a situation of Bari Vishema, but over here he admits that we would not go based on her position because it's Bari Uvari, Midiktani Umodu Rabbi Yoshua. Because if we look at the Mishnah then continues and says, and Rabbi Yoshua also admits that Rabbi Yoshua, who in the previous parak was not willing to rely upon her version of events. So, for example, the Gemara is going to now sort of try to understand what this is based on, but let's say for now that so, for example, in the situation of when she says Misher Astanine Enasti, right? That he thought that he was marrying a Basula. It turns out that she was a Beula. Her argument is Misher Astanine Enasti. Yes, that I was raped after Erisin, and therefore I'm still owed 200 zuz. And now Rabbi Yoshua had said in the previous period that even though, right, we had mentioned Amigo a few days ago, even though she could have theoretically made a better argument, right, because Rabbi Gamliel's argument in this case was to say, well, since if she was lying, she would have made a better argument, which is to say Mukas Eitz, but instead she went with Misher Astanin and Asti, which in the event of if the husband was a Kohen, she wouldn't be able to remain with him because a Kohen is not able to remain with a Anusa. So Rabbi Gamliel says, look, since she could have made a stronger argument, so therefore that's clearly an indication that she's telling the truth, because if she was lying, she would have said that she was a Mukas Eitz rather than Misher Astanin and Asti. Now, Rabbi Yoshua had said, meh. Rabbi Yoshua said that we cannot necessarily rely upon that migo, that we can't simply say that just because she could have made a better argument, therefore we can't believe her. However, now here's the tie into our parak. However, Umod Rabbi Yoshua, even though Rabbi Yoshua is unwilling to sort of rely upon the migo in the first parak, in the case of the fields, where Ruvain unsolicitedly says to Shimon that this field that we're looking at once belonged to your father, but I purchased it from him. So in that case, since Ruvain could have just kept quiet and not said anything to Shimon at all, and nobody would have suspected anything. And so since he could have just kept quiet, but he was forthcoming and saying to Shimon, by the way, this field belonged to your father, but your father sold it to me. Since in this case it was sort of unprovoked, so since he could have kept it quiet, and instead he, and nobody would have said anything, but now he mentioned that it belonged to Shimon's father, but that Shimon's father sold it to him, Reuven. So then he is believed in this case of Migo, right? So Umod Rabbi Yoshua, so I'm back in the Gemara, right? Midiktani Umod Rabbi Yoshua, from the fact that our Mishnah says, and Rabbi Yoshua admits. So then that is kind of an argument to say that the Reisha could even be Rabbi Gamliel, right? So if, as we just explained, as we've been explaining until now, that the Reisha of the Mishnah can even be according to Rabbi Gamliel, that even though in the first parak, Rabbi Gamliel was saying that we rely upon her version of events, but that's only because it was Bari Vishema. However, we could say that in our parak, in our Mishnah, where she's saying that she was certainly a Besula, he's saying no, she was certainly a Be'ula. So in that case, we cannot necessarily simply rely upon her, i.e. Rabbi Gamliel is admitting that when it comes to Bari and Bari, so we're not going to rely upon her. And similarly, Rabbi Yoshua, who in the previous parak was unwilling to recognize Amigo, was unwilling to say that, well, if she was lying, she would have said that she was a Mukas Eitz. right? And therefore Rabbi Yeshua says, nonetheless, we cannot rely upon her testimony. Yet, when it comes to Ruvain saying to Shimon that the field belonged to Shimon's father, but that he, Ruvain, purchased it from him, where it was unsolicited, he didn't have to say anything at all. So in that case, Hapesha also, Hapesha Hitir, Rabbi Yeshua would admit that since he didn't have to say anything at all, and nobody would have suspected anything, since he was forthcoming and Ruvain said to Shimon that the field once belonged to Shimon's father, he's also then believed to say, but Shimon's father sold it to him. So says the Gemara, so kind of like I was saying right for the last few minutes, that if we say that the Reisha is Rabban Gamliel, and that he's admitting that even though in the first parak, Rabban Gamliel was saying that we rely upon her because Bari V'Shema Bari Adif, but however Rabban Gamliel admits that in our parak where it's Bari Uvari, then we would not rely upon her. So Shaper said, I understand what Rabbi Yeshua is then admitting to, and saying sort of, and symmetrically, Rabbi Yeshua, who in the previous parak was unwilling to recognize Rabbi Gamliel's migo, over here, by the fields, he's willing to say Apesha also, Apesha Hitir, and rely upon that migo. But if you say that the Mishnah is unlike Rabbi Gamliel, and therefore Rabbi Gamliel isn't admitting to anything, well then, Rabbi Yeshua Laman Modeh, then what's Rabbi Yeshua sort of symmetrically admitting to? If we say that Rabbi Gamliel is admitting in the Reishus, then it makes sense to say, and Rabbi Yeshua is admitting in the Seifa. But if you're not saying that Rabbi Gamliel is admitting to anything in the Reisha, well then what's Rabbi Yeshua admitting to, right? The Mishnah had said, Umod Rabbi Yeshua ba'omer lechaveru, etc. That seems random. Why all of a sudden we're talking about fields and Apesha Asur who Apesha Hitter? What does that have to do with anything? But if we sort of set it up in such a way that the Reisha is Rabbi Gamliel and that Rabbi Gamliel is admitting to something, well then it also makes sense to continue in saying, well, by the way, Rabbi Yeshua also admits to something. Right? So Yamad Lo Ayra Rabbi Gamliel b'modeh, Rabbi Yeshua Laman Modeh. So then if you say that the Reisha is not talking about where Rabbi Gamliel is admitting to anything, well then, what's Rabbi Yeshua admitting to? To which the Gemara answers, Misavad Rabbi Yeshua ahai pirkin koi? So, to which the Gemara says, well, who says that Rabbi Yeshua is responding to the Reisha? Who says that we have to view it as the first part of the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel is admitting to something, and therefore the second part of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yeshua is admitting to something? Maybe Rabbi Yeshua is not responding to the first part of the Mishnah. Maybe Rabbi Yeshua is simply responding to something, to a machlokas from the previous parak. Right? Who says that Rabbi Yeshua is talking about this current parak, the second parak of Ksubis, and that he's replying to the Reisha of the Mishnah? Amigo koi v'apirkin kama koi. He's responding to the migo from the previous parak. He's not responding to the Reisha of our Mishnah. He's responding to a discussion from the previous chapter. Aheya. Now, the Gemara wants to understand which case in the previous chapter is he responding to. So I had mentioned a few minutes ago Misherastani Nenasti, but we're going to entertain the possibility that it could have been any of the other ones. Maybe when she's mukas eitz, or maybe that she became pregnant from a kohen. Any of those things, we're going to try to figure it out. So ilemo aho. So if we say that Rabbi Yeshua is responding to the following case, hoisemu uberes, that if she was pregnant, v'amrula mativo shel uberze, and they say to her, no, who'd you get pregnant from? Meish ploni v'kohenu. She says, well, I got pregnant from a certain fellow, and he is a priest. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Om Ne'emenes. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer said we could trust her that she got pregnant from a priest. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo Mipia Anuchayin, and Rabbi Yeshua says no, we cannot necessarily assume, we can't rely upon her, and we cannot assume that she became pregnant from a kohen. So, and then if we're going to say, and even though Rabbi Yeshua doesn't rely upon her there, but there's some other, even though that migo wasn't good enough, so Rabbi Yeshua nonetheless says that in our case of Apesha, also Apesha Iter, we would rely upon a migo. Hasum migo ika. But what migo argument is there to say in the situation of when she claims to have gotten pregnant from a kohen? What better argument could she have made? Harikresa ben Shinel. What could she have said, that she was like a mukas eitz or something? I mean, she's clearly pregnant. So it's unclear what sort of migo what sort of better argument she could have made in that case. Elo, aho. Rather, it's referring to the following case. They saw her speaking with a certain fellow, and there was of course machlokas between Zeiri and Rav Asi about what exactly speaking means. Does it mean that she was secluded? Does it mean that they had bia? And they say to her, "No, who is this fellow? Ish ploni v'choinu," and she says, "Well, it's a certain fellow, and he's a priest. He's a kohen." Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Modim, Omer Ne'emenes. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say we could rely upon her and assume that the fellow was a priest. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo mipia anu chayin, and Rabbi Yeshua says that we cannot rely upon her. Hasu migo ika. Well, over there also, what is sort of the better argument that she could have made? Hanichal Zeiri. Well, I can understand this according to Zeiri. The Amar Mai Medaberes Nistera. That Zeiri says, what does it mean that she was speaking to a fellow? It means that she was secluded with the fellow. Migo de ibaya amra lo nivalti vika amra nivalti mehemno. Well, since she could have made the argument that she didn't have intercourse with this fellow whatsoever, and yet she's admitting, well, I did have intercourse with the fellow, but he was a kohen and he's a kosher. Well, okay, so since she could have made the better argument that she didn't have intercourse in the first place, so that's sort of a migo argument. She could have made a better argument, and nonetheless Rabbi Yeshua does not rely upon her, but Rabbi Yeshua would admit in the case of the fields of a pesha also a pesha heater, okay. But El Rav Asi, do Amar Mai Medaberes Niveles, but according to Rav Asi, who says, what does it mean that she was speaking to this fellow? It means that she had bia with this fellow. So my migo ika, well then what stronger argument could she have made? Right? Meaning she had bia with a certain fellow. They say, who is this fellow? She says he's a kohen. What sort of stronger argument could she have made from that? Ve'elo aho. So rather, Rabbi Yeshua is responding to the following case. He omeres mukas eitz oni. She says, right, meaning they get married. He thinks that she's a besula. It turns out that she's a beula. She says, oh yes, but that's because I made mukas eitz. Omer loki eledrusas ishot. And he says, not true. You're not a mukas eitz. You had relations with a different fellow. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Ne'emenes. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say we can rely upon her. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo mipia anu chayin. And Rabbi Yeshua says that we cannot rely upon her. Hasu migo ika. So what is the possibility for a stronger argument that she could have made? Bishlam Rabbi Elazar, Domar b'manav v'lo klum. So I understand, according to Rabbi Elazar, who says that, well, when she claims to be a mukas eitz, she's saying that she deserves 100 zuz, and he's saying v'lo klum. He's saying, no, it was a mekach tos. I thought I was marrying a besula. It turns out I married a beula. I shouldn't have to pay anything at all. Migo di bayo amra mukas eitzani tachtecho ve'isla mosayim. Well, the migo is, in that case, well, since she could have said, I was a mukas eitz after we got engaged, and therefore she could have claimed all 200 zuz. But instead she's saying, look, I was a mukas eitz from before the marriage, in which case she's really only saying that she deserves 100 zuz of the ksuba. Mehemna. Okay, so then she's believed. So, okay, so in that case there is a migo argument that since she could have said that she was a mukas eitz after engagement, but she says that she was a mukas eitz from before engagement, which limits her ksuba to 100 zuz as opposed to 200 zuz. Okay, so I understand what kind of migo argument there is, what kind of better argument there could have been. Ella, Rabbi Yochanan da'omer b'masayim umana my migo ika. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that she's claiming that because she's a mukas eitz, she should get 200 zuz, and he's saying no, she should only get 100 zuz. Well, in that case, what is the better argument that she could have made, right? How could she have positioned herself any better? So elo aho. So rather, it's referring to this case, hanose esayishav lamotzula besulim, that if a fellow and a fella get married and it turns out that she's not a besula, he omeres misherastani ne'enasti. She says that, well, after engagement, after erisin, I was raped, and you're stuck, and I'm owed 200 zuz. My Ksubis 200 zuz. V'hu omer, and he says, Loki ela achlei rastich, and Rabbi Yeshua, and the fellow responds and says, not true. It's not misher stanin enasti. Rather, you slept with somebody else before our engagement, and therefore I shouldn't have to pay you anything, although I reckon, yeah, okay, fine. Therefore I shouldn't have to pay you anything. Where am I? Okay, fine. So Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, so Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer say that she is believed. Rabbi Yeshua Omer lo mipiha anuchayin. Rabbi Yeshua says that we cannot rely upon her. Demigo di ibayo omer mukas eitz ani tachtecha. Well, since she could have said, instead of saying that she was raped, which would mean that if he's a Kohen then they cannot remain together, but instead she says, meaning she says that she was raped, which means that in an event that he's a Kohen, they would not be able to remain together. But she could have made the argument that she was a mukas eitz after they got engaged, in which case she would get the same 200 zuz, and even if he was a Kohen, they would be able to remain together. That by saying that she's a mukas eitz, she would not have made herself also to a Kohen, but instead she says that she was raped, which makes her possible to him if he is a Kohen. So she could have made a better argument, and therefore because she could have made the better argument of mukas eitz, but she said Misher Astani Ne'enasti, Rabbi Gamliel says we can rely upon her because of the migo. We can assume that she's telling the truth. And Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Gamliel, look, B'hai migo dehacha modinalach, b'ahu migo dehasum pligono ilavach. To which Rabbi Yeshua responds, he says, look, I'll admit to you that we can rely upon a migo in a situation of a pesha also, a pesha hitir. In a situation of, Ruvain tells Shimon, by the way, this field belonged to your father, but I bought it from him. So in that case, we could say we could rely upon a migo. But be'ahu migo dehasum pligono ilavach. But regarding when he says to her, look, I thought I was marrying a Besula, it turns out you're a Be'ula, she says, Misher Stani Ne'enasti, that is not a migo that we can rely upon. Michte hai migo v'hai migo, ma'ishna hai migo me'hai migo. To which the Gemara says, why? Why is Rabbi Yeshua willing to rely upon a migo in the situation of the fields, but he's unwilling to rely upon the migo in the situation of this marriage? So, well, because there's a key difference, which is that in the situation of the fields, it was unsolicited. Nobody was coming and saying to Ruvain, Ruvain, this field doesn't belong to you, it belonged to Shimon's father. Nobody's coming and saying that. Right? There's nothing, so there's no immediate evidence in front of us that Ruvain now has to defend himself against. Ruvain was, unsolicitedly saying to Shimon that this field belonged to his father, but that he, Ruvain, purchased it from Shimon's father. So in that case, we say a pesha also, a pesha hitir. The same Ruvain who made this field potentially usher to him by saying that the field belonged to Shimon's father is also the one who's making it now mutter to him by saying that he purchased it. But in the situation of this husband and wife, she's not sort of unsolicitedly suggesting that Misher Astani Ne'enasti. She's responding to a accusation against her. Ruvain is coming, not Ruvain, her husband is coming and saying that he thought he was marrying a Basula. It turns out that she's a Ba'ula. Now she's defending herself by saying Misher Astani Ne'enasti, and therefore Rabbi Gamliel is willing to say, well, she could have said mukas eitz, which would have been a stronger argument, but she went with Misher Astani Ne'enasti, which means that she was telling the truth, because if she was lying, she would have gone with the stronger argument. To which Rabbi Yeshua responds and says, we can't rely upon the migo in that case where she's applying to an accusation, where she's replying to an accusation, responding to an accusation, where it's shashachot lefanenu, where there's already sort of evidence in front of us that she's responding to. In that case, we cannot rely upon the migo, argues Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, very interesting stuff. So now it says the Gemara, oh, so now the Gemara wants to know, one second. We said a little bit earlier that most women, right, who are getting married, I guess assuming it's the first marriage, so if the assumption is that most women, when they get married, are bisulos, so if that's the case, Why do we need witnesses to come and testify that, Shiyotzos B'Yinuma, V'Rosha Parua? Why can't we just go based on the majority that most women who get married are besulos? So Amar Ravina, Mishum Dika Lememar, Rov Noshim Besulos Nisos Umiut Amanos. Well, because, says Ravina, look, yes, while most women who get married are besulos, but some are not. V'chol anisais besula yesh lakol. And the thing is that whenever a besula gets married, people would know that she is a besula. There's more of a sort of call about it. There's more of a energy about it. People would know that she is a besula, that it's a besula who's getting married. V'zo ho ve'ein la kol isra la ruba. Now the thing is, in this case, for whatever reason, people didn't necessarily know. There wasn't that same buzz that she got married as a besula. And therefore, so we want to make the argument that shouldn't we just assume that she was a besula because most girls who get married are besulas? Well, the thing is that, generally when a besula gets married, right, we're saying the majority of girls who get married would be besulas, but there's a call, there's a sort of a buzz about it, and the yentis and everybody, they know that she is a besula, but this was not the case, and therefore it's suspicious, and it's like, well, why didn't we all know that she's a besula? Maybe in this case she was actually a beula. Well, call, right, so ve'ena kol Israel aruba, therefore the sort of majority assumption gets weakened. Equal anoshim besulos, equal anises besula yesh la kol. Well, if that's the case, that whenever a besula gets married, there's sort of a buzz about it and people know that she's a besula, ki asu edim ma'have. Well, then who even cares that she then produces witnesses, sheyotzos b'inuma v'rosha parua. Hanach sadeh shakrinenu. Clearly those witnesses are lying. Meaning, if whenever a besula gets married, there's a buzz about it, and all the yentis know that she's a besula, well, and that's the case, if that's right, and if there isn't this buzz around it, well then, mistama she wasn't a besula, so then even if she produces witnesses that she was a besula, and shiyotzos b'numa v'rosha parua, so isn't it obvious that these witnesses are lying, because nobody else seems to know about it? So Ela Amar Ravina, Rov Anises besula yesh lakol v'zoho ve'ein lakol isra laruba. No, not every girl that gets married, a besula, is there a buzz about it, but in most cases there's a buzz about it. In this case, there wasn't a buzz about it, so therefore we can't just assume that she is a besula, but she comes with witnesses who say that she was a besula, so we could rely upon these witnesses. So now the Gemara asks an interesting kasha. Right, so the Mishnah had said, Yesh edim shotzos abinum v'chulei, v'leichush dema mafka edim b'hai beidino v'gabio, v'hodor mafka l'leksuba b'hai bezdin v'gabio bo. Friends, do you hear the kasha? Maybe you were wondering about the kasha, but it's a good kasha. The Mishnah seems to be assuming that we're talking about a situation where there is no ksuba, right? If there was a ksuba, if there was a physical document, a contract that said that her ksuba is 200 zuz or 100 zuz, then there's nothing to talk about it. We have a document. This is talking about a situation where, for whatever reason, there is no document, and therefore we're relying upon witnesses. Perfectly Gemara, shouldn't we be concerned? Maybe there are witnesses who are coming to one bezdin and saying that yes, that she went out behinuma v'rosha parua v'gabia, and she's going to collect 200 zuz. And then she's going to go to a different court, and this time, all of a sudden she has a ksuba, and she's going to collect a second time. The first time she collected based on witnesses, and the second time she's going to collect the ksuba nachamol, a second time with the ksuba, with the actual document. Babo says, well, this is clearly a support for the notion that we write a receipt, that when the husband pays the ksuba, he receives a receipt that the ksuba has been paid. So therefore, when she comes to the second bezdin with the ksuba and tries to receive her payment a second time, the husband comes with his receipt and he says, look, I already paid it once. Rav Papa Amar b'makom she'ein kozvin ksuba askinan. Rav Papa says that we don't necessarily write a receipt because receipts are shtickle headache. Meaning, how would a receipt work? The husband pays the ksuba, he gets a receipt. Now what? He's got to hold on to the receipt forever. There's no computers, he can't scan it, he can't put it in Google Drive and have it forever. He's gotta store it somewhere. And what if the mice are gonna come and they're gonna eat it? It's a headache for him to have to hold on to this receipt. It's a headache for him to have to hold on to this receipt, and then the burden of proof becomes upon him, right? So if she goes now to a second bezdin to collect the ksuba a second time, if he can't bring a receipt that he paid it already once, then he's going to be stuck paying a second time. But Papa says it's a headache. So instead what they would do is, if there was in fact a document, so what they would do is, they would give him the document once it's been paid. But the thing is that here we're talking about a situation where they actually didn't write the Ksubis. There was a place where the minig was not to write down the Ksuba, and therefore there's no concern that she's going to go to a second bezdin with the physical document to collect it a second time, because it was in a place where that was not the minig, that they wouldn't write Ksubis, and therefore there is no concern that she's going to pull out the Ksuba in the second bezdin, because this is a place where they actually didn't write Ksubis. That's what Rav Papa says, right? There are those who explain this machlokas between Rav Papa and Rav Abau on a brisa. If the Ksubasa, that if she lost her Ksubah, hitmina Ksubasa, or she hid her Ksuba, or she, stashed away her Ksuba someplace and she doesn't remember where, nisrifa Ksubasa, or if her Ksuba got burnt. Rakdu lefanel, if there are witnesses that they sort of danced before her in, a way that indicates that she was a besula at the time of the chasana, sochaku lefanel, or they, were doing happy things, playful things before her at the chasana. Havir lefanel kosha besora, or they passed before her a cup of announcements. We're going to explain later on what that is. O mapashal besulim, or this cloth that has her dam besulim on it. Okay, whatever. If there are witnesses for any of these things that would indicate that she's a besula, well then her ksuba is 200 zuz. Like we asked earlier, but shouldn't we be concerned that maybe these witnesses are going to testify in one bezdin and enable her to collect her ksuba, and then she's going to pull out the ksuba in a second bezdin and collect the ksuba nachamol a second time? So Amr Babao Zosumez Kozvin Shov. So Babao says, well, clearly this indicates that they would write a receipt and give it to the fellow, give it to the groom, and give it to the husband, and then he'll be able to prove, he'll be able to pull out the receipt in the second bezdin and say, look, this ksuba has already been paid. Papa Amr b'makom shein kozvin askinan. Says Papa, we're talking about a place where they didn't actually write ksubas, and therefore there's no concern that somebody's going to show up with the ksuba in a second bezdin, because there is no ksuba. What do you mean, Papa? How can you say it's talking about a place where they don't write ksubas? The brisa literally said if she lost her ksuba, or if she hid it, or whatever it is. So clearly we are talking about a place where they write ksubas. So dichasav lo ihu. So Papa says, no, it's a place where they don't write ksubas, but he, for whatever reason, wrote a ksuba. Alright, sof mafkula v'gabi ba. Okay, fine, so he wrote a ksuba. But still, shouldn't we be concerned that this guy who wrote a ksuba, and now she has it, she'll go to a second court and whip it out and force him to pay a second time? So my ibda ba'or. So Papa says, well, what does it mean that she misplaced her ksuba? She misplaced it in fire. She lost it in fire, i.e., it's history. There is no ksuba now. If that's the case, that's the same thing as the ksuba getting burnt, right? We gave 3 examples. She lost it, she hid it, and it got burnt. So if we're saying that she lost it, she lost it in a fire, well, isn't that the same thing as it having gotten burnt? Also, what do you do with the fact that when she says that she hid the ksuba? What does hiding it mean? Okay, and the Gemara, says something funny, which isn't super easy to understand what it means, but also it says that she got lost, which seems to be basically the same thing as the first one. Okay, so the question is, we seem to be talking about a situation where there is a ksuba. So why is Papa saying that we're talking about a situation where there is not a ksuba? Ella, Kol ibda ki itmina b'fanenu dami. No, rather, the way to understand it is that if she had a ksuba and it got lost or it got hidden and she doesn't know where it is, right, and we would not give her the ksuba based on that, because we'd have to be concerned that she's double dipping. Until witnesses say that the document is dafka burnt, and then we don't need to be concerned that she's going to pull it out in another bezdin. So those who say that the machlokas between Rav Papa and Rav Abo is dafka on the brisa, that Rav Abo is willing to make his argument that it's talking about where there is no divorce document, even in a situation where it clearly indicates that there was a divorce document, and he goes out of his way to say, yeah, but it's dafka talking about where it got burnt. So if Rav Papa is willing to make his argument in the brisa, well, then certainly in our Mishnah, where it's just simply easy to argue that it's talking about a situation where there was no divorce document because they're in a place where they don't write divorce documents, well then certainly Rav Papa would make his argument there. But the one who says that the machlokas between Rav Abo and Rav Papa is in our Mishnah, where it doesn't actually mention that there was a physical divorce document. So there Rav Papa is going to say where it's talking about a place where they don't write divorce documents. But in the brisa, which is clearly talking about where there was a document and it got lost or it got hidden or burnt or whatever it is, so Rav Papa wouldn't argue there and say that it's talking about a place where they don't write divorce documents, because it's harder to make that argument when the brisa is specifically talking about the existence of such a document. So the Mishnah had said, that if there are witnesses, then we could believe that she was a besula. So now says the Gemara, but 1 second. Shouldn't we be concerned? Okay, so forget about the ksuba, right? Forget about, the witnesses testifying in one bezdin and then she pulling out the ksuba in the second bezdin. Forget about the ksuba. Shouldn't we be concerned that the same witnesses are going to come and testify? Or let's say even maybe, I don't know, there were lots of people who were at the chasana who could testify, Shiyotzos Beinuma, V'rosha Parua. So shouldn't we be concerned that there are going to be witnesses who go to one bezdin and testify that she's a besula? And then there will be witnesses that go to a second bezdin and testify that she is a besula, and therefore she's going to collect her ksuba multiple times. So, and for the Gemara, b'makom tul efsher v'adei kosvinan shover. Look, yeah, that's true. In a place where we don't have a choice, clearly it's like what Rabbi Abo says, that we write a receipt, and that way he would be able to prove that the shtar has been, that the ksuba has been paid, right? Meaning, if we're talking about a situation where there is no ksuba document, and how is this guy going to be able to prove that he's already paid this money? So certainly in that case, we would write him a receipt that he can hold on to prove that the ksuba has been paid. And if witnesses show up in a second court to argue that she should be able to collect her ksuba, well, he would be able to prove that the ksuba has already been paid. So we mentioned this cup of announcement. What's this cup of announcement? My koshel besora, Amar v'ada barahava, kos yain shel truma ma'avir in the fanel, that they bring before her a cup of truma wine. Kloma ru'uya haisa zolecho betruma, to indicate that this girl is a besula and she's able to eat truma if he's a kohen. Maskef Rav Papa to Amona Milo Achla betruma, says Rav Papa, I don't understand. In Amona Bas Yisrael, who marries a kohen, she can also eat truma. So how does sort of this wine of truma indicate that she's a besula rather than an amona? El Amar Papa Zoratius Ketruma Ratius. No, the point is that they bring out a cup of truma wine to say that just like truma is called ratius, so she's also a ratius, she's also a first, she's a besula, it's her first time getting married. Tani Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, Chav shel yain ma'avrin lefanel, says Rabbi Yehuda that they would bring before her a barrel of wine. Amar v'ada barahava besula ma'avrin lefanel stuma, be'ula ma'avrin lefanel psucha. Says v'ada barahava that if she was a besula, then the barrel would be closed, and if she was a be'ula, then the barrel would be open. Amai, how come we need sort of a closed barrel and an open barrel? Ni'avid kami besula, kami be'ula lo ni'aver klal. Why don't we just, if she's a besula, bring the barrel of wine, and if she's a be'ula, bring no barrel of wine? Why do we need, in both cases, for there to be a barrel of wine, but one of them to be open and one of them to be closed? So Zimnin de Tafsa, Mosayim, V'omra, Ona Besula Avoy, V'haidilo, Avru Kamoy, Isnuseu de Isnisu. Well, because we're concerned that in that case, she might just grab 200 zuz in the case of divorce or whatever, and then they'll say, hey, give that money back because there's no witnesses to say that there was this barrel at your wedding, to which she'll say, well, that's just because everybody got so drunk that they didn't bring out the barrel, right? But if it's a situation where in either event there was a barrel, but if she was a besula, it would be a closed barrel. If she was a beula, it would be an open barrel. Well, then she wouldn't really be able to make an argument because, how is she going to defend the fact that the barrel was open? So, therefore, if there was no barrel at all, she can make the argument, well, there should have been a barrel, but everyone was so drunk at the chasana that they didn't bring it out. But once we say that in both cases there's going to be a barrel, but just that by a besula it's closed and by a beula it's open, well then, she doesn't really have an argument to make, if the barrel was open, since it's clearly an indication that she was a beula. Friends, that was daf Tes Zayin of Masechta Ksubis. It's talking an interesting daf. Right, we talk about a situation where she argues, right, comes time to collect the ksuba, she argues that she was a besula when she got married, therefore the ksuba should be 200. He argues that no, she was a be'ula at the time that they got married, therefore the ksuba, right, so she wants 200, he says no, the ksuba should only be 100. We said that in this case, even Rabbi Gamliel would admit that we go based on him, not based on her, because in this case it's bari uvari, as opposed to in the previous parak it was bari v'shema. However, Rabbi Yoshua, who in the previous parak was unwilling to go along with Rabbi Gamliel, who says that we can rely upon a migo, that since she could have made a stronger argument, but she made a weaker argument, therefore it means that she's telling the truth. Rabbi Yoshua says that's not the case. But in a situation of hapesha also hapesha hiter, a situation where sort of if Reuben says to Shimon, this field belonged to your father, but I purchased it from him, that sort of there was nothing provoking him to say that the field belonged to Shimon's father, and he nonetheless said it, but then he immediately said that he purchased it. So in that case, we could rely upon the migo. We could rely upon the fact that there was no shorshachut lefanenu, that there was nothing forcing him to divulge this information. So therefore, we could trust him in its entirety. That a pesha also, a pesha hitir, that both the fact that yes, it once did belong to Shimon's father, but also that it now belongs to him. We then asked a question that shouldn't we be concerned that maybe she's going to come to Bezdin with with witnesses to say that she's a basula, and then show up at another Bezdin, and all of a sudden she produces this divorce document, and then she'll collect it a second time. So Rabbi Bo says, well, after the husband pays the divorce document, we will give him a receipt. Whereas Rav Papa says that it's a situation where there actually was no divorce document, and therefore we're not concerned about her pulling out the divorce document in another bezdin. Then we said, but what about, shouldn't we be concerned that the witnesses might show up in several batei din? So we say, look, the truth is, if we have to, we'll write a receipt and give it to the husband, so that he could prove that the get has already, that the ksuba has already been paid. Okay, that was daf Tes Zayin of Masechta Ksubis. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.